think I'm going to stand up because I sometimes get overexcited when I speak, and it's very difficult to do if you're sitting down. And sometimes when I get overexcited, I speak too quickly. So apologies in advance, but I will do my best to keep my language quite slow. So good evening, everyone. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Fundación MAPFRE and Ignacio and Francesca in particular for organizing this event and for inviting me to come to Madrid to talk to you this evening. Now, I imagine you're wondering who on earth I am and why I'm here. So let me introduce myself. My name is John Holden. I'm a visiting professor at City University in London, and I used to be head of culture until recently at the think tank Demos in London. Here's the Demos logo. Now, Demos is a not-for-profit educational charity, and although unlike many think tanks, it is not politically aligned, it is politically connected. It exists in a space that brings academia, politics, the third sector, charities and business together to find a way of doing things better for everyone. It's therefore, in some senses, a pretty unusual space where we've had the leaders of all three of our British political parties at events where you get some very odd juxtapositions of people. Here's our new Prime Minister, David Cameron, with a Labour MP, Frank Field, and this woman, Camilla Batman-Jelly, who heads up a children's charity in London. The strangest juxtaposition I ever saw was seeing a five-star general in uniform sitting next to the rock star Brian Eno in the front row. Now, I think it's important for me to explain the context because the theme of my talk this evening is cultural diplomacy. And what I have to say about it comes from research that we undertook in this context at Demos that resulted in this pamphlet, which can be downloaded free if you want to read it from this website. The research, which took us to China, India, France, the United States, Norway, and Ethiopia, was funded by a group of major cultural institutions in the UK. The British Museum, the British Library, the British Council, the Royal Opera House, the Royal Botanic Gardens, the Natural History Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. So it comes from, and I come from, a cultural standpoint rather than a foreign affairs or trade-related background. But the pamphlet was addressed to a broad audience in civil society and in politics. Indeed, I'm pleased to say that it resulted in the issue of cultural diplomacy being debated in our Parliament, in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and it provided a rare instance of cross-party consensus about the importance of the subject. I think that the political and also the media interest in the pamphlet in Britain was just part of a wider trend, because cultural diplomacy is a subject that seems to be of increasing interest and concern right across the world. Indeed, in the last year, I've been to some far-flung places to give lectures about cultural diplomacy, and I've experienced the climatic extremes of the freezing Canadian winter in Calgary and also the torrid Australian summer in Adelaide. The interest in the subject of cultural diplomacy is interesting in itself because it suggests that some kind of change is happening in the role of culture in international relations. And what I want to do tonight is to examine that shift in the role of culture in our lives and to persuade you that we need to reassess what we mean when we use this term, cultural diplomacy. So let me begin with a traditional view of what cultural diplomacy used to mean, which is in fact a view that many people still hold. In this view, we start with the idea that cultural diplomacy is a subset of a wider notion of public diplomacy. If you think about diplomacy itself, historically, in the pre-modern world, relations between different nation states were conducted through formal ambassadorial channels and international gatherings of monarchs, religious leaders, or their representatives. Added to this, were the trading relations that brought business and banking elites into contact with each other. Now, we should not underestimate the ability of people and goods to travel relatively freely in the pre-modern period. For example, the blue colouring in this 9th century manuscript made in Ireland contains lapis lazuli from Saudi Arabia. And from Herodotus to Marco Polo to Ibn Battuta, we have accounts of scholars, merchants, and just the plain curious travelling many thousands of miles to visit distant lands. Having said that, the lot of the vast majority of people was to live their lives in a very narrow geographical space. Foreign pilgrimages to Jerusalem, Santiago, or Mecca were once-in-a-lifetime experiences for a tiny minority. Mostly, people stayed within walking distance of their fields and went only as far as their local market town. So in that world, diplomacy was essentially a matter of elites having direct contact with each other. In the modern era, that changed. Newspapers, books, radio, and TV broadcasting meant that people began forming their opinions through common media. Nation-states responded by inventing the concept of public diplomacy. In other words, the idea that governments could, and indeed should, transmit messages directly to the populations of other countries. This was done in some very crude ways, like the leaflets dropped into combatant nations in wartime, and in some direct ways, like establishing radio stations to beam news and other programs abroad. And it was also done in some covert and subtle ways, like the American CIA indirectly funding the display of abstract expressionist art in order to demonstrate American values of freedom in the 1950s. These types of communication are called propaganda when they're produced by your enemies, and called winning hearts and minds when you produce them yourself. So in the modern era, we move from contact between nations and peoples being restricted to conversations between a few people in elite groups at special and often quite formal moments, to a situation where elite groups in government additionally attempt to communicate with whole populations. In modern times, then, we have both elite-to-elite communication and elite-to-mass communication. Now, in these circumstances, I think we can talk about soft power, because it makes sense for governments to think in terms of pursuing their interests through a mix of force, broadly conceived to include sanctions and the threat of force, which is hard power, and through means of persuasion and influence. But persuasion and influence only work on an audience that is receptive, and increasing the chances of that audience being receptive is essentially what soft power, famously invented by the American academic Joseph Nye, is all about. In the soft power view of the world, cultural diplomacy is thought of as a subcategory of public diplomacy. Here, culture is a tool of government. Government uses the arts and culture in a number of ways. First, culture becomes the setting in which elite-to-elite meetings can take place on relaxed ground outside the business forum or the summit gathering. The best example of this that I've witnessed was when I saw the British Foreign Secretary of the time standing together with the Deputy President of Iran on a platform at the British Museum's Great Persia exhibition a couple of years ago. A second way that culture is used in this way is as a way of demonstrating the qualities, the standing, and the values of a nation through the display of its heritage and traditions. This is what India has been doing over the last decade, with a whole series of lone exhibitions right across Europe and the United States. And third, culture is used as a means of sending messages to whole populations through music, art, film, and so on, which is why China has been setting up the culturally focused Confucius Institutes with their message of harmony around the globe. Confucius Institutes now exist in over 60 countries, from Belarus to Nepal and from Chile to Kenya. Now, there are several points to stress about this soft power model. At a very basic level, it assumes that politics creates the space in which arts and culture operate. The belief is that political agreements and political relations enable cultural exchange and artistic expression to flow freely. Because taxes and governments fund the culture that we're talking about here, and diplomats and government agencies operate the systems of cultural diplomacy. So politics is the controlling power over culture. The second assumption is that the point of cultural diplomacy is to exercise power. Soft power is still power. It's still about achieving your own aims. It's just that it is done in more peaceful and subtle and cost-effective ways. Finally, there is the assumption that governments can manage this activity, even when they are being hands-off and not in direct control. Now, what I want to argue tonight is that all three of those assumptions are incorrect. They're widely held by governments across the world, but they are wrong. Rather than politics creating the space for culture, we should think of culture as creating the operating conditions for politics. Rather than thinking about culture as a tool for exercising power, we should be thinking of culture in terms of mutuality and respect. And finally, we must also accept that governments have very little control over what happens in the cultural world. In this new model, rather than thinking of cultural diplomacy as a subset of public diplomacy, we should think of it as a subset of cultural relations. And in the field of cultural relations, we've seen a radical transformation over a very short period of time. To explain why that's happened, we need first of all to look at the way that the meaning of the word culture itself has changed over the last half century. There was a time, back in the 20th century, when a spade was a spade, and not a postmodern designer implement with the embedded potential to move Earth. But even then, we had a lot of trouble with this word culture. For a really compelling discussion of it, I would point you in the direction of this man, the Cambridge professor and cultural critic Raymond Williams, and his seminal book Keywords, first published in 1976. Back then, when Raymond Williams was writing, culture, the word culture, was principally used in two senses. And many people, probably the majority of people, still think of it in this way. On the one hand, culture meant the arts. And the arts were an established canon of art forms: opera, ballet, poetry, literature, painting, sculpture, music, and drama. These arts each contained their own hierarchies, and they were enjoyed by only a small part of society, and a part of society at that which was also, generally speaking, well-educated and rich. This social group defined its own social standing not just through money and education, but through the very act of appreciating the arts. And thus artistic consumption and social status became synonymous, causing the arts themselves to be labelled as elitist. But culture also had a different meaning than the arts, an anthropological meaning that extended to include everything that we did to express and to understand ourselves, from cooking to football to dancing to watching television. Now, these two meanings of this one word, culture, led to much confusion because they were essentially in opposition. Culture in the sense of the arts and popular culture were mutually exclusive. One was called high, the other low. One was refined, the other debased. As an individual, you could aspire to high culture, but by definition, high culture could never be adopted by the mass. If it was adopted by everyone, it would no longer be high culture. So the confusion caused by these two essentially contradictory notions of what culture meant led to all sorts of curious consequences, not least in politics, where approaches to culture cut right across the division between left and right. You can find the arts attacked from the left, for being an exclusive middle-class pursuit, and attacked by the monetarists of the Reaganite and Thatcherite right for being an interference with the market. But you can also find the arts defended strongly on the left for being one of those good things in life that everyone should be able to enjoy, and also being defended on the right as something that has a civilizing and calming influence on our society. The old model of culture, then, is an either-or model. But I think we now have to understand a completely new reality. And that means that we have to abandon these old ideas about culture as a set of oppositional binaries of high culture and low culture, refined and debased, elitist and popular. The new reality demands a different way of looking at what culture means, and hence new ways of looking at the value of the arts and culture. It demands a shift in the political response to culture, and it requires changes in the way that cultural funders and cultural organizations go about their businesses. It presents a new set of opportunities as well as challenges for everyone involved, not least in this field of cultural diplomacy. So let me move on to explain how I see this new reality. I believe that now, for practical purposes, there are three deeply interrelated spheres of culture. We have publicly funded culture, commercial culture, and homemade culture. They are not separate, they are not in opposition to each other. They are completely intertwined, but they're different from each other in important ways. In publicly funded culture, culture is not defined through theory, but by practice. What gets funded becomes culture. This pragmatic approach has allowed an expansion of what culture in this sense means, so that it now includes things like circus, puppetry, and street art, as well as opera and ballet. So who makes these decisions about what to fund? And hence to define this type of culture is therefore a matter of considerable public and political interest. For example, official responses to the cultural production of different community, social, ethnic, and faith groups carries deep significance in terms of validating or accepting different cultures within the definition of what a government and a society sees as culture in the first place. Commercial culture is equally pragmatically defined. If someone thinks there's a chance that a song or a show will sell, it gets produced. But the consumer is the ultimate arbiter of commercial culture. Success or failure is market-driven. However, access to that market, the elusive big bucks record deal that Bruce Springsteen sings about in Rosalita, the stage debut, the publication of the first novel, this is controlled by a commercial Mandarin class who are just as powerful as the bureaucrats of publicly funded culture. So in both publicly funded and commercial culture, there are gatekeepers who define the meaning of culture through their decisions and who act as a barrier between the artist-producer and the potential consumer of these types of culture. Finally, there's homemade culture, which extends from the historic objects and activities of folk art through to the postmodern punk garage band and the YouTube upload. Here, the definition of what counts as culture is much broader. It's defined by a self-selecting peer group, and the barriers to entry are much, much lower. Knitting a sweater, inventing a new recipe, writing a song and selling it on the internet, these might involve a great deal of skill, but they can be done cheaply and without much difficulty. And the decision about the quality of what is produced then lies in the hands of those who see, hear, or taste the finished article. Now, in all three of these spheres, individuals take on positions as producers and consumers, authors and readers, performers and audiences. Each one of us now is able to move through different roles with increasing fluidity, creating and updating our identities as we go. Artists travel freely between the funded commercial and the homemade sectors. For instance, publicly funded orchestras make commercial recordings that get sold in record shops and exchanged on file-sharing websites. Street fashion inspires commercial fashion, and a band may get a record deal and then play in a publicly funded music venue. The rapid and enormous expansion of the internet as a space for cultural communication and as an enabler of mass creativity has changed the possibilities for all three spheres of culture and all forms of cultural expression within them, because it presents across the board a wealth of new opportunities, such as new audiences, new art forms, new distribution channels, but also a new set of questions: what to do about intellectual property, how to invest in technology, how to censor things, for example. Crucially, it's changed the debate about quality from being one where the arts are naturally superior to popular culture to one where quality is debated in niches wherever it's found. The question now is not, is ballet better than TV, but is that a good TV program? Was that a fine performance of Othello? How do these jazz players rate? And so on. The internet is credited with driving the mass creativity that's found in homemade culture, but in reality it's only one of the factors that explains it. Cheap musical instruments, the availability of digital camcorders instead of expensive film, new public investment in galleries and theatres, the education system, all these things have played a part. And as you can tell from that list, the public, the commercial and the homemade have become inextricably linked together and interconnected, feeding off each other. We have an overall culture where these three spheres are now intensively networked. Now, does all that matter? Is that switch from a binary model of the arts and popular culture, the high and the low, to a triple model of funded culture, commercial culture, and homemade culture, is that anything other than a kind of elegant professorial exercise? Well, as you might guess, my answer to that is very definitely yes. It's profoundly important. And let me explain why. Under the old model, politics could confine culture and cultural policy to a very narrow field, and hence it tended to have a really low priority for governments. In the old model, popular culture could be left to its own devices. You might want to put some limits on the content of books and films and censor them. You might want to license the playing of live music in pubs because it's noisy, but popular culture could more or less get on with it and take care of itself. As for the arts, so-called high culture, well, there you might want more people to have access to it because you think it's a good thing. You might want to argue that as a matter of national status, you should have a gallery and an opera house, but you would conceive of culture as something essentially peripheral, a leisure pursuit, an ornament to society, something to be afforded and indulged once the hard business of the day was over. Under the old model, all three types of culture appear weak and defective. Publicly funded culture can be dismissed as an elitist and minority pursuit. Commercial culture can be scorned as lowbrow, unintelligent entertainment. And homemade culture can be patronized as amateur recreation. But put them all together, and what you have is, to quote Jordi Martí from Barcelona, the second ecosystem of humankind. Because in fact we are all listening, reading, watching, dancing, playing and making the whole time these days. This means that cultural policy can no longer be confined to a small budget line and a narrow set of questions about art. On the contrary, if we understand culture in the terms that I've outlined, as a mass activity and a networked activity, where funded, homemade and commercial culture are deeply interconnected, then we can start to appreciate the wider value of culture to and within society. Let me give you three brief examples. The first relates to the economy. Creative work, brain work, added value from design, from cultural production, are an increasingly important feature of successful economies. Indeed, it's this part of the economy that has shown the most rapid growth over the last 20 years, right across the OECD. In London now, our creative economy is as big as financial services, something that 20 years ago would have been completely unthinkable. The strikingly successful performance in things like film, fashion and music have created enormous prosperity throughout Europe and huge economic spin-offs. And significantly, the areas of the economy that appear to be weathering the storm of the credit crunch best are related to the cultural and creative industries and to tourism, which goes so much with it. So even looked at and valued from just this economic perspective, culture has become much more important in its own right and also across a much broader canvas. The culturally driven industries are having not just an economic but also a huge social impact right across the planet. Think how fashion now connects art schools in Europe to factories in Bangladesh, and how magazine photography links Milan with Mumbai. The second example of the increasing importance of culture is in relation to identity, where we now define ourselves not so much by our jobs, because those come and go, and not so much by our geography, because we move around and commute much more than we did. We define ourselves by our cultural consumption and production. I am who I am, and you are who you are, because of what we watch, read, listen to, write, and play. Again, this has a global aspect. Identity formation through culture no longer means adopting a narrow set of cultural forms and inherited traditions. We now have access to and can become enthusiasts for and start to play with cultures from all over the world. This is true not just in cosmopolitan cities, where on any night of the week it's possible to watch Katha dance, listen to reggae, and see the work of Chinese artists. It's happening everywhere. I'll never forget 10 years ago sitting around a campfire in central Madagascar, 4 days' walk from the nearest road and the closest electricity. A group of musicians appeared with homemade instruments made out of wood and stolen wire, and they started to play. And the second song that they played was by the Jackson 5. The third example of somewhere where culture has become much more important is, of course, in foreign relations. Mass tourism, 24-hour news, cheap flights, internet blogs, and citizen journalism have combined to shrink the world. Because of these changes, we are all having much more interaction with and exposure to other people and other nations. We encounter difference at every turn, and what happens on the streets of New York 1 minute can lead to riots in Islamabad the next. In these circumstances, we understand each other and also misunderstand each other through the medium of culture. This has a number of implications for international relations and indeed for the nature of artistic production. To begin with, we no longer have relatively separate artistic cultures developing in isolation within their own traditions. Instead, we have cultures that mix, mingle, and morph to create something new. Artistic exchange, of course, is not new. You only have to look at the history of the Silk Road or read Orhan Pamuk's book, My Name is Red, to realize that. But the capacity of artists to work together and to share what they do more widely has grown over the last 10 years in a way that makes a fundamental shift. On top of that, the way that cultures encounter each other has essentially changed. I described the history of cultural relations earlier in this talk as starting with one elite getting together with another, and then having an additional dimension of an elite giving cultural messages to mass audiences. Both of those things still happen, but we've now shifted fundamentally and irrevocably to a new model where we also have mass peer-to-peer cultural contact. And the fact of mass peer-to-peer cultural contact increases the importance of culture as a factor in how nations relate to each other. For example, the way that a museum in Germany deals with objects from, say, Turkey, the way that it interprets, respects, or fails to respect that country's culture matters. Because when millions of Turkish visitors or migrants see their own culture valued, that provides one of the building blocks that gives the German government a certain license to operate in the world. To take another example, it means that the way that ancient Persians are portrayed in a Hollywood film becomes significant in a way that goes way beyond questions of aesthetics, artistic quality, which was terrible, or entertainment. I would argue further that in cultural relations, because of mass peer-to-peer contact, we are moving away from the idea of soft power exercised by one party upon another, and towards one of mutuality based on equal cultural respect. The arena of culture is one where where nations can meet on more equal terms, where, if you like, Bob Marley and Bob Dylan can look each other in the eye in a way that the United States and Jamaica clearly can't. I've noticed in my own country, the UK, that the people in the smaller nations of Wales and Scotland seem to have a different relationship with their inherited culture than we do in the larger nation of England. In the Celtic nations, people are aware of their cultures in a much more visceral way, as markers of their distinctiveness and identity than we tend to be in England. That can have healthy effects in nurturing a sense of history, rootedness, solidarity, and community. But it can also have a less healthy effect in promoting exclusivity, intolerance, and the ossification of culture, by which I mean cultural forms can fail to develop and grow. But to return to my theme, in all these three examples, the economy, identity formation, and foreign relations, culture has moved from being something at the sidelines to something at the center. That profoundly changes how we should value culture and how we should judge the significance of culture. It also makes cultural policy a lot more complicated. For instance, whereas giving a 13-year-old schoolchild the opportunity to visit a museum might once have been a nice-to-have experience that brought a civilizing influence to bear on a young mind, now a visit to the museum is an essential part of plugging that young person into the network of culture, which affects that person's job prospects, their ability to operate in a globalized world, and their sense of individual and communal identity. And just as cultural policy is now interconnected with wider issues, so too do those wider issues affect what happens in culture. For instance, we need to think about how visa policies affect visiting artists and hence their knock-on effect into international relations, how planning policies can add to or destroy the value of the creative industries. Above all, we need to think about how education policy can release the creative talents of everyone. Cultural policy interventions, then, are becoming much more complicated. In an online article 3 weeks ago in the Huffington Post, the head of the Kennedy Center, Michael Kaiser, said this: "Most people do not know that no fewer than 9 government agencies in the United States provide support to the arts. In addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, arts money is also granted by the Departments of Commerce, Education, State, Agriculture, Defense, and Transportation." The same thing is now happening in many countries across the world. Culture is now something that matters right across the field of governance. One problem that cultural policy faces is how to operate in this new interconnected world of cultural diplomacy. When I and my colleagues at Demos wrote Cultural Diplomacy 2 years ago, we were accused of suggesting that governments should decide and dictate what artists do. Nothing could be further from the truth. Right at the start, we say, this report does not argue that culture should be used as a tool of public diplomacy. In fact, if governments do try to exercise control, it completely undermines their chances of success. The question of whether cultural diplomacy implies government control over artists goes to the heart of the relationship between the arts and politics, a relationship that is already complex and ambivalent. The American writer Philip Roth described the difference between politics and the arts in these terms. He says that politics is the great generalizer and literature the great particularizer. And not only are they in an inverse relationship to each other, they are in an antagonistic relationship. He asks, how can you be an artist and renounce the nuance? But how can you be a politician and allow the nuance? Stravinsky was making a similar point when he said, it's the individual that matters, never the mass. The mass in relationship to art is a term which has never once entered into my consideration. And from a political perspective, Lenin put it another way when he said that he hated listening to Beethoven because it made him want to caress people's heads when he should be banging them together. The point here is that politics wants to achieve mass social outcomes. So it values culture in terms of what culture can do to achieve those outcomes, whatever they may be. Politics will always want to look at culture in this way. It makes perfect sense. And that means that politics will always have to have a highly ambivalent relationship with culture, being pulled in two directions at the same time. Because while it wants to control the outcomes of culture, it also wishes to distance itself from culture. We can see that clearly in Western democracies, where politicians have been keen to detach themselves from decisions about funding the arts. Why is that? I think there are a number of reasons, and they're these. First, there's a historical explanation. These Western cultural funding systems were set up at the start of the Cold War with the communist bloc and Western democracies. And Western democracies did not want the arts to be seen to enforce state ideologies. Second, politicians did not and do not want to be answerable for what artists do, and who can blame them? Art pushes boundaries. Sometimes it's deliberately offensive and provocative. I had a conversation last year with the Minister for Culture of one country who was very relieved that he didn't have to take direct funding decisions because it meant that he didn't have to defend artists who were being pilloried in the press. As he put it, I'm as broad-minded as the next person, but painting trees blue, well, that's just ridiculous. The third reason why the arts and politics can be uneasy bedfellows is because the arts are about things that politics doesn't really approve of. The arts are creative and risk-taking, and one of the jobs of politics is to reduce uncertainty and to minimize risk. Politics doesn't like surprises. The arts do. On top of that, the arts can be oppositional and challenging, and politicians don't really like opposition either. So there are all these good reasons why politicians want to keep some distance from culture. But on the other hand, they want to interfere in the arts to try to make sure that the arts are achieving the politicians' wider goals for society and to make sure that public funding is properly accountable. When it comes to cultural diplomacy then, governments are going to experience this tension, where they recognize that artists must be independent, but they cannot ignore the new reality of global cultural interconnectedness and the role that culture plays in international relations. Perhaps a way out of this difficulty of artistic autonomy versus political control lies in taking the emphasis away from politicians and artists and thinking instead about what rights people in general should have in relation to the international aspects of culture. Here, the American writer and former chairman of the US National Endowment for the Arts, Bill Ivey, has some interesting things to say in his book, Arts, Inc. He argues that the population at large should have a series of rights in relation to their cultural life. In relation to cultural diplomacy, the three most important rights are the right to know about and explore art of the highest quality that has survived right around the globe. Second, the right to be exposed to the artistic practice of artists at work today. And third, the right to have one's own culture represented faithfully to the rest of the world. These concepts are not without difficulty, not least the implication that nations display some cultural homogeneity and that there is a set of shared values around culture that apply across a whole society. Nevertheless, I think that Bill Ivey has started a debate and a line of thinking that's worth exploring in relation to cultural diplomacy. Essentially, that means shifting from a model where cultural diplomacy is the concern of elites, artists, politicians, and professionals, to a model where we are all involved. Because, as we put it in our Demos pamphlet, we are in fact all diplomats now. Thank you.
Gracias y buenas tardes. Yo voy a tomar una perspectiva distinta de la de John Holden, no solo porque él habló de pie y yo voy a hablar sentado, sino sobre todo porque al abordar el tema de la diplomacia cultural Yo la voy a abordar más desde la perspectiva de las relaciones internacionales que del mundo de la cultura, que es lo que él ha hecho. Es decir, voy a tomar más en cuenta el papel de los gobiernos y no solo el papel jugado por las masas, como él insistió tanto en su exposición. A mediados del siglo XIX, un ministro británico decía que Inglaterra no tenía ni amigos permanentes ni enemigos permanentes, sino que tenía intereses permanentes. Y esto evidentemente condicionó el funcionamiento de la diplomacia durante mucho tiempo. Es decir, la diplomacia tenía que centrarse de alguna manera en la defensa de los intereses nacionales. Y evidentemente, aquí, en esta defensa de los intereses nacionales, hay que añadir de alguna manera, y esto fue algo que fue cambiando a lo largo del tiempo, el tema de los valores. No solamente la diplomacia empezó a defender intereses, sino que con el correr del tiempo empezó también a defender algunos valores. Eso sí, en algunas circunstancias la defensa era mucho más intensa y comprometida, y en otras mucho más laxa y sobre todo más testimonial. Hoy, con las revueltas o revoluciones, según la palabra que se utilice, que están teniendo lugar en el norte de África, el tema de los valores, como democracia, derechos humanos y otros, está ocupando un lugar central en la discusión, no solamente sobre el papel que la diplomacia tiene que jugar en estos acontecimientos, sino sobre todo en el papel que Occidente o Europa y Estados Unidos pueden y deben jugar en estas cuestiones. Y aquí nos encontramos entonces con otro elemento importante a tener en cuenta, que es el papel que la cultura juega o puede jugar en toda esta interrelación. Porque es verdad lo que planteaba John Holden sobre ese papel jugado por la cultura y cómo la cultura ponía en contacto a las masas de distintos países, de distintos continentes. Pero ocurre que la cultura no es algo neutro, sino que la cultura también es utilizada en numerosas ocasiones como un arma arrojadiza. Un arma en el cual, o un arma que sirve para que unos pueblos se enfrenten a otros pueblos. Y aquí, evidentemente, por ejemplo, el tema de la cultura del Islam versus la cultura de Occidente está presente. Y esto tiene que ver con otro elemento que está presente en esa gran expansión cultural, en ese gran Big Bang cultural al que estamos asistiendo, que es el de los medios masivos de comunicación, Internet, las comunicaciones baratas a las que se aludía, etcétera, etcétera. Porque esto, por un lado, acerca culturas, pero al mismo tiempo favorece la creación de grandes guetos nacionales de unos países en otros. Y esto afecta evidentemente los movimientos migratorios y la forma en que estos movimientos migratorios tienen lugar. Si uno repasa lo que era el día a día de una colonia de inmigrantes, española, irlandesa, italiana, o turca o rusa, en América, en cualquier lugar de América del Sur o del Norte, a finales del siglo XIX o principios del siglo XX, y lo compara con lo que es el día a día de las colonias de inmigrantes en la actualidad, encuentra grandes diferencias, notables diferencias. En ese entonces, la comunicación con los lugares de origen era sumamente difícil. Y esto de alguna manera favorecía al menos una cierta integración. Hoy la situación es totalmente diferente. Por ejemplo, hace pocas fechas, el primer ministro británico declaraba oficialmente el fracaso del multiculturalismo en Gran Bretaña. Claro, esto nos hace preguntarnos, bueno, ¿cuál es la política más adecuada a seguir con los movimientos migratorios? ¿Es posible la asimilación, un término que prácticamente ya no se usa, que ha caído en desuso? ¿Es posible el multiculturalismo? ¿Hay que defender a ultranza las distintas identidades nacionales? ¿Cuál es la respuesta más adecuada a dar en estos casos? Y aquí es uno de los terrenos, no el único, pero sí uno de los terrenos donde la diplomacia cultural puede jugar un papel. Y evidentemente las definiciones sobre qué es o qué se pretende con la diplomacia cultural, y repito, utilizando el concepto de diplomacia cultural en un sentido mucho más estricto, pues tiene que ver con decisiones políticas y gubernamentales. Y evidentemente la diplomacia cultural servirá, por un lado, para impulsar o promocionar determinados valores, pero también para la venta de la imagen de un país, de la imagen de marca de un país, que es fundamental para la defensa, promoción y exportación de determinados bienes culturales y no solamente culturales. Yendo más concretamente al tema de las relaciones entre Europa y América Latina y España y América Latina, a la hora de plantearse acciones de diplomacia cultural, evidentemente hay un tema central que es el de la comunicación. Manejamos idiomas comunes y sobre todo manejamos valores comunes. Cuando hace prácticamente una década atrás surgieron las cumbres Unión Europea, América Latina y Caribe, se planteó la relación entre Europa y América Latina como una alianza estratégica. Una alianza estratégica, se decía, fundamentada en la existencia de una serie de valores comunes, valores compartidos, valores que surgían de la pertenencia al mundo occidental. Inclusive un autor francés, Alain Rouquier, escribió un libro que se llama América Latina, el extremo occidente. Es decir, América Latina estaba, perdón por la expresión coloquial, en el quinto pino, pero ese quinto pino formaba parte del mundo occidental, un poco el far west del occidente, del extremo occidente. Pero lo que podía tener un sentido hace 10 años atrás, es decir, a comienzos de la década, o perdón, hace 20 años atrás, a comienzos de la década de los 90, hoy ya no lo tiene tanto. Por ejemplo, en un país como Bolivia, nos encontramos con que el Ministerio de Cultura no se llama Ministerio de Cultura, se llama Ministerio de Culturas, en plural. Y esto evidentemente tiene que ver con la concepción multiétnica y plurinacional que del país ha instaurado la nueva Constitución Nacional Boliviana. Pero lo más curioso del caso no es solamente la utilización del plural, sino que la principal Secretaría de Estado del Ministerio es la Secretaría de Descolonización. Y esto implica partir de la idea de que durante 500 años existió un proceso de colonización, no solo político, no solo económico, sino también cultural e ideológico, y que en estos momentos corresponde a las nuevas autoridades en un nuevo escenario político del país, cambiar las cosas y, sobre todo, dar vuelta a ese proceso de descolonización. Hoy estamos abocados en estos años a la celebración de los bicentenarios de las independencias latinoamericanas. Frente a esta situación, el gobierno español se planteó acompañar, y este es el término oficialmente utilizado, acompañar a los gobiernos y a los pueblos latinoamericanos en sus celebraciones. Y esta idea del acompañamiento ha condicionado toda la política española en relación con los bicentenarios. Y creo que este momento es oportuno para plantear una comparación, aunque rápida por motivos del guión, entre las celebraciones de los bicentenarios y la celebración del 5º centenario del descubrimiento de América o del encuentro de dos mundos, como también se dio en llamar. En el año 92, o en los años previos que llevaron al 92 y en el 92 en definitiva, el papel protagónico de España era indudable. De España habían partido las 3 carabelas comandadas por Colón que llegaron a América. De España o de Europa, en definitiva, habían salido los conquistadores y los capitales que irían a producir ese milagro que hizo posible la presencia europea en América. Un milagro que, también hay que decirlo, provocó profundas convulsiones en el territorio americano. Pero de lo que no hay duda, y esto era algo totalmente indiscutido, es que España tenía un papel protagónico, reforzado con la Expo de Sevilla, reforzado también con la puesta en marcha del sistema de cumbres iberoamericanos, que es uno de los pilares de la política española hacia América Latina. Por el contrario, en esta ocasión, el papel de España, primero, es mucho más discutido. Es decir, ¿tiene algo que decir España en el momento en que se celebra la independencia de los países latinoamericanos o de las nuevas repúblicas latinoamericanas? Evidentemente sí. Porque si contra alguien se realizó ese proceso fue contra España, que era la potencia colonial en ese momento. Cuando se plantea la celebración de los bicentenarios, siempre tengo presente la forma en que Gran Bretaña celebró también el bicentenario de la independencia de las 13 colonias, hoy Estados Unidos, en 1976. La principal actividad, también se planteó la discusión, ¿tiene algo que decir Gran Bretaña en relación con la independencia de Estados Unidos? Pues sí, evidentemente los británicos tenían algo que decir. Y la principal actividad que realizaron los británicos para conmemorar la independencia fue una gran exposición celebrada en Greenwich, en el Observatorio de Greenwich, donde lo que se planteaba era recrear la independencia de Estados Unidos con la mirada británica. Y esto era muy curioso, porque primero se hacía con un gran sentido del humor que tienen los británicos, con, iba a decir una gran objetividad, pero bueno, con una cierta objetividad, la objetividad posible en estos casos, pero con una cierta distancia bastante apreciable respecto al tema de la independencia de los Estados Unidos. Y la reflexión que en ese momento me surgía era, bueno, cuando en España se pueda hacer algo así, mucho habrá cambiado en este país. Primero porque es difícil tratar el tema de América Latina con un cierto sentido del humor. No solamente porque de este lado del Atlántico se es muy solemne, sino que del otro lado del Atlántico se es todavía más solemne, lo cual evidentemente implica poner en solfa esto de las relaciones. Pero sobre todo porque la pérdida de las colonias todavía en algunos sectores de la opinión pública española, inclusive del mundo académico español, se vive en presente. Es decir, no se vive como algo pretérito, como algo pasado. Es decir, se vive todavía como un drama de todo lo que se perdió, no solamente en Cuba, sino todo lo que se perdió en América y sobre todo en algún discurso de todo lo que perdió América al desprenderse de la tutela española. Yendo o volviendo a los bicentenarios, la aproximación española entonces era el del acompañamiento. Y esta idea del acompañamiento partía de la base de que el papel protagónico ya no recaía en España, sino que recaía en los distintos países, en los distintos gobiernos, en los distintos pueblos que conmemoraban sus independencias, sus bicentenarios. Y aquí creo que hubo un cierto error de interpretación en esta idea del acompañamiento. Porque la idea del acompañamiento, de alguna manera, encubría otra idea, que era la de que era posible realizar algún tipo de festejo de ámbito regional o algún tipo de festejo iberoamericano, para encontrar una palabra que pueda englobar a todo el conjunto del universo de ambas orillas del Atlántico. Y sin embargo esto no fue posible. Es decir, no fue posible un festejo de ámbito regional. Hubo una sola actividad iberoamericana y quizás con un alcance mayor, una sola, que fue una regata de grandes veleros, la mayor parte de ellos navíos escuelas de las marinas de guerra de los países de América Latina, más España, más Portugal, más Estados Unidos y algún otro. Fue la única. Y luego, más allá de un cierto turismo presidencial que escondía distintos alineamientos ideológicos y distintas políticas vinculadas con relaciones bilaterales y de vecindario, no fue posible ir más allá. Y decía que aquí había un cierto error de aproximación, en tanto que la forma en que hasta ahora se habían celebrado los aniversarios de las independencias era una forma estrictamente nacional. Es decir, América Latina es una región que se caracteriza por un fuerte nacionalismo, y en esto de las independencias, que es el momento en el cual se acuñan, se desarrollan las identidades nacionales, más todavía. Por tanto, el componente nacional era un componente central a la hora de explicar estos festejos de los bicentenarios. Y esto fue lo que finalmente terminó pasando. De ahí la imposibilidad, no solo de que España en su acompañamiento coordinara tareas con los gobiernos latinoamericanos, sino algo todavía más grave, y es que los propios gobiernos latinoamericanos pudieran coordinarse entre sí a efectos de desarrollar algún tipo de festejos birregionales. Es evidente que el fracaso de los nacionalismos, el fracaso de los bicentenarios, no responde únicamente al tema de los nacionalismos, que hay otras cuestiones, como la falta de presupuestos debido a la situación de crisis económica internacional en el cual se desarrollaron los festejos, la improvisación, la falta de presupuestos, etcétera, etcétera. Y quizás desde la perspectiva cultural, o al menos de una cierta cultura, un fenómeno interesante por un lado, pero preocupante por el otro, con el cual nos topamos en algunos países en relación con los festejos de los bicentenarios, fue en una necesidad de reescribir la historia por parte de quienes estaban o quienes están en el ejercicio del gobierno. Evidentemente que antes hablaba de la cultura como un arma arrojadiza, y aquí la historia, como parte de la cultura, también se convirtió en un arma arrojadiza. Un solo ejemplo, vinculado de alguna manera al fuerte adanismo que caracteriza la vida política latinoamericana, donde el síndrome del redescubrimiento permanente de la rueda es una constante que hay que encontrar en muchos de estos países. Evidentemente lo que se trata es de hacer tabla rasa con el pasado y de revalorizar únicamente lo que se ha hecho a partir de la fecha en que el gobernante de turno empezó a regir los destinos de su país. En ocasión del 199 aniversario de la independencia argentina, no del 200, sino un año antes, ya sentando un poco la tendencia de lo que iba a venir después, la presidenta argentina decía que su país, Argentina, por fin, era un país en el cual se podía vivir. Y comparaba de alguna manera el bicentenario inminente y los grandes avances sociales existentes en ese bicentenario inminente con las condiciones en que se había celebrado el primer centenario de la independencia argentina en 1910. En esa época, una de las características de la vida argentina era la fuerte inmigración. Cientos de miles de personas procedentes de todas partes del mundo llegaban a Argentina a buscar un lugar donde vivir, donde trabajar, donde instalarse. Pues bien, la señora Kirchner decía, muy suelta de cuerpo, que el primer centenario se había celebrado bajo estado de sitio, cosa verdadera, pero de alguna manera diciendo que las condiciones de vida no tenían nada que ver con las condiciones de vida presentes, donde sí había justicia social, había salarios dignos, etcétera, etcétera. Claro, en esto de las comparaciones, evidentemente, lo determinante es el punto de comparación. ¿Con qué uno compara? Y lo que no vale es decir, hoy las condiciones de vida son mejores que hace 100 años atrás, válgame Dios. Si las condiciones de vida de un país no son mejores que hace 100 años atrás, vaya país del que estamos hablando. Pero si comparamos lo que eran las condiciones de vida en Argentina en 1910, que por ese entonces tenía el 7º u 8º PIB per cápita más importante del mundo, pues, y lo comparamos con las condiciones de vida de otros países europeos, de otros países asiáticos o de otros países de otras partes del mundo, uno se explica por qué centenares de miles y millones de inmigrantes decidieron vivir en Argentina. Y esto tiene, evidentemente, un pequeño matiz autobiográfico, porque cuando mi tatarabuelo eligió Argentina para vivir, yo pensaba, pero mi tatarabuelo debía ser un poco tarado, porque si tan mal se vivía en Argentina, como dice la señora presidenta, pues ¿para qué fue ahí? Hubiera elegido otro destino. Pero bien, dejemos esto de lado y vayamos a una reflexión final. Y esta reflexión final pasa por preguntarnos si es posible una acción concertada desde el punto de vista cultural, de la política cultural, entre España y América Latina. Quisiera en este punto parafrasear al presidente del Congreso, José Bono, cuando decía que es mucho más lo que nos une que lo que nos separa. Por supuesto que yo estoy hablando de América Latina y él estaba hablando del señor Macías de Guinea Ecuatorial, pero bueno, este matiz al margen, digamos, yo creo que la pregunta es pertinente, y entre aquello que nos une, está en primer lugar, evidentemente, la lengua, como demuestra la acción concertada de las academias. Y esto, el tema de la lengua, se vincula en esa relación que nos planteaba también John Holden sobre las tres formas de hacer la cultura, con el negocio cultural o las industrias culturales, con el mundo de Internet y sobre todo con la conquista de un mercado tan importante para el español como es el de Estados Unidos. Ahora, esto evidentemente implica una acción concertada mucho mayor, implica acuerdos más firmes, implica que instituciones como el Instituto Cervantes, por ejemplo, que ya lo tienen, tengan una apertura todavía más abierta hacia América Latina. En ese sentido, la experiencia de los Cervantes con los institutos mexicanos de cultura en Estados Unidos creo que es un precedente interesante para profundizar. Pero de todas maneras, esta acción concertada debe tener presente la existencia de dificultades, de obstáculos, es decir, que pese a hablar una lengua común, hay cuestiones que pueden separarnos, como el hecho de que algunos países latinoamericanos, algunos pueblos latinoamericanos, algunos gobiernos latinoamericanos niegan su pertenencia a Occidente, por ejemplo, o no comparten o tienen otra apreciación de los valores democráticos. Y esto nos debe llevar a una reflexión en torno a en qué medida esa acción concertada es posible y sobre todo si esa acción concertada debe plantearse de una forma bilateral, es decir, con distintos países, o de una forma global con el conjunto de la región. Gracias.